Now I just went live. Hi, welcome to this edition of Museum Moments with Jewish Museum Milwaukee. Today we have a very special guest for you guys, and I'm excited to round out our week on education with Dr. Jonathan Pollack from all over. He has a number of different positions in Madison, including at the Mossy Weinstein Center, the International the Institute for Humanities Research. I have to get all of those initials right in my head. And MATC. Most recently, he's published a book called Wisconsin, the New Home of the Jew, 150 Years of Jewish Life in Wisconsin. And there it is, right there in front of you. So today, we're going to talk about something that I feel like a lot of people who grew up in the 40s, 50s, 60s knew about, but I don't know if they understood how to quantify what we're talking about. And I think people who grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s might have no idea that this is a thing. So throw in the comments here what you guys, if you are reflecting some of those stories. But Dr. John.
Yeah.
When we talk about admissions quotas, what's the period we're talking about, and what does it mean when I say, oh, there were admissions quotas for Jews at schools?
Sure. So the admissions quotas at American colleges and universities really began in 1922. And just to back up a little bit before that, one of the things that's important, why like 1922 and not some other time, is that it's really like after World War I, which ended in 1918, that college became like an expectation for many American Jewish kids. That before that, yeah, I mean, there were Jewish students in American colleges like back into the 19th century, but in most parts of the country, that was a very rare thing. That was only like the wealthiest families could afford to have their kids go to school, go to college for some period of time, and not work in a family business or not be out working themselves and bringing money home. And then even in the first couple decades of the 20th century, you see a lot of the Jewish students who were there would go for like a year, maybe 2 years, get some training, oftentimes in something, again, that would like help the family business. So they'd take accounting classes, and so the family business could do a better job of keeping track of money coming in and out, that sort of thing. And once they acquired that, like the skill was more important than the degree. But after World War I, there was kind of, so a lot of the initial immigrant generation, or the first generation of people born in the US, were now adults and were beginning to move out of the kind of sweatshop and really small scale entrepreneur jobs that many people know about from their family histories at that time. And so Jewish students were starting to aspire toward the professions, toward law school and med school, business school, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they started going in large numbers. And one of the colleges they went to in large numbers was Harvard. That in Boston.
How did Harvard feel about that?
What's that?
How did Harvard feel about that?
Harvard initially was kind of okay with it. I mean, Jewish students were kind of like adjacent to the main culture of Harvard because many of them were commuter students. They commuted in from Chelsea and from other Jewish neighborhoods and suburbs of Boston at that time. And so it was kind of like unusual. It was like kind of like a novelty, but by 1920, Jewish students made up roughly 20 to 25% of the student population at Harvard. And so in 1922, the president of Harvard says, well, wait a minute, if this keeps up, Harvard will no longer be Harvard. Harvard will be something else. And he tried to, in a kind of classic move for discrimination in higher education and the professions and so forth, he didn't like throw out some kind of inflammatory statement about, filthy Jews or something like that.
Right.
Very, he couched it in, well, actually, Harvard is like a national university. Harvard is the best university in the United States, and therefore, Harvard should prioritize admitting students from around the country, so it's not just like Boston that gets to go there.
Oh.
And so as a result, Jewish enrollment at Harvard plummeted. I mean, Jewish alumni of Harvard saw right through that. And they said, you've got to be kidding me. And there were it was like newspaper coverage and magazine coverage around the country. There's a famous article that ran in The Nation that was really calling that out and saying, that's bogus. This is anti-Semitism, plain and simple. But the other effect that had is that colleges around the country over the next 4 or 5 years, like most of the other Ivy League schools, with the exception of Penn, many of the schools like in the tier competitive with the Ivies, so like your Williams, Amherst, Wellesley, etc., they adopted that. Some state universities and other prestigious private schools in other parts of the country took their cue from Harvard and said, oh yeah, we've got to do the same thing here. And so as a result, and in many parts of the country, and especially in the Northeast, state university systems weren't really built up yet. I want to say there were like maybe a handful of SUNY campuses that mainly concentrated on agriculture, education for different parts of New York State. University of Connecticut was nothing. UMass was still like an ag school. So it's not like here in the Midwest where there was always, like a fair number of Jewish students rising number of Jewish students at UW or at Michigan or at Ohio State and so on.
And so how would they implement a policy, if you see Jonathan Pollack or Ellie Gettinger, you don't have any idea that we're Jewish, aside from saying, well, maybe Pollack is a Jewish last name, maybe Gettinger is. Clearly, I'm not going to Harvard anyway because I'm a woman in 1922. But aside from that, how would they implement the kind of how would they know if you were Jewish or not?
Great question. So on admissions forms, they would ask for, and even like UW-Madison did this, which did not have quotas on admission, which I'll probably talk about later. They would ask for student's nationality and parents' nationality. So they could sort of guess, they could sort of triangulate and figure it out. So if the parents were born in Russia, they'd sometimes ask for like the parents' mother tongue. So parents are in Russia and they speak Yiddish, like what are the chances they're not Jewish? Universities, and I don't know offhand if Harvard did this or not, but universities often required a photo.
Oh.
So you've got somebody who has kind of like a Jewish nose or curly hair like this and so forth. They're like, okay, so we got this name. We've got parents who are born abroad somewhere in the Pale of Settlement. They'd ask for religion sometimes. So there are ways around it. I mean, part of the reason I'm wearing this shirt today is this shirt is something I inherited from my wife's grandfather, who went to Cornell in the 1930s. And he changed the family name. The name was originally Solomon, which is often a Jewish name, but not always. And he changed it to Sard, S-A-R-D. And my wife's grandfather was Jewish, but like from a very secular family. He was he was active in the socialist movement in college. So I'm guessing he put down on his admission form just none. And so Edward Sard from New York City, he went to Bronx High School of Science, getting in there about 1930, they're like, okay, we don't know. And he made it in. So that's the kind of thing a lot of people did, that a lot of people changed their names to go, or just put down no religion or left it blank or whatever. Ed's parents were both born in Russia, but they denied it their entire lives. Like they came here as very little kids. So he may well have said, yeah, my parents were born in New York. And like, all right, We got
around the how does this impact? So UW-Madison doesn't institute quotas, as you said.
That's right.
What are the ways that this comes down in 1922 and all of these East Coast schools start limiting their admissions? How does that impact Madison?
Yeah, so it happened by 1926, and Madison was like a lot of other kind of state flagship universities that had this idea. Madison in the 1920s, UW was really trying to broaden its image from like a state university to like a national and even an international university. I mean, there's Chinese students coming into UW in the 19-teens. Yeah. So they really like this idea of Wisconsin becoming like an international center for like whatever people want to study. And so administrators at Madison, like their counterparts at some other state universities, said, okay, here we got this opportunity. there are a ton of students in the New York metropolitan area and Boston and Philadelphia who desperately, desperately want to go to college. And the main colleges in their area are not taking them. So what if we do something to encourage students to come out here? So UW created something called the Experimental College. It was like a small liberal arts college within the broader UW. It's a thing a lot of universities have gone to in the intervening time. It was like Harvard, like Williams at the time. It was men only. And the Experimental College idea was developed by Alexander Michaeljohn from Amherst College in Massachusetts, who was teaching in philosophy and education at UW. His idea got basically no traction in state, but out-of-state students heard about it and came to Madison. So UW, in a way, really attracted, especially undergrads, to come here. Now, I have to walk back something I said a couple minutes ago. UW absolutely had quotas for its med school.
Right.
And probably for the law school as well. But, given that a much smaller percentage of Americans went off to college at all, and even tinier percentage of Americans went on for advanced education. But yeah, so the med school had quotas, but undergraduate admissions, by contrast, were very friendly. What Jewish students encountered who came to Wisconsin, though, especially those who came from out of state, was that even though UW had to, they sort of like gave a seal of approval to landlords in the campus area. And the off-campus area at this time where people lived was generally like State Street, Langdon Street, a lot of properties around where now like the Cole Center is, like down at where the parking ramps are, like south of campus toward the bike path and the railroad tracks. Landlords who wanted to get university approval had to keep their properties up to code. They had to make sure they rented only to men or only to women. But discrimination, like the UW, was completely hands off. So
like you can have whoever, you can say no to any of our students.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. There was no requirement to that if a Jewish student wanted to rent an apartment or in your building or stay in your boarding house, you could just have a policy flat up front that's just like, Ellie Gettinger, I'm sorry, I think you're Jewish, you're not staying here. And then you would have to go like find somewhere else. In fact, that's one of the services that UW-Hillel provided in its early years was you could go to Hillel and talk to the director, and he would say, all right, here's who you should talk to about finding a place to live.
So they kept like a list of this is actually...
Yeah, they seem to have kept some kind of list, and the list doesn't survive. It's not in their archive.
Tragic.
But yeah, it sounds like there was definitely like kind of common knowledge of landlords who are more or less receptive.
Was there any system of public dorms at this point, or everything was kind of in the realm of this?
Yeah, no, there absolutely were public dorms, but Wisconsin had a smaller percentage of its students in dorms than its counterpart universities, than like Michigan or Ohio State did. Those colleges went much bigger into building dorms on campus. And UW's philosophy was, and again, not thinking about the Jewish angle and not thinking about discrimination in renting. UW was like, oh, there's like tons of rental properties all around campus. What do we need to build dorms for? People can live on Langdon Street and there's steps to campus. So that's what Jewish students faced. That was the big discrimination, was really housing early on. Into the 30s, when entrepreneurs started building private dorms for a target audience of out-of-state Jewish students. The people stepped up to the plate. They saw this was going on.
So the private dorms came as there was an audience and a need, and they're like, well, there's money to be made here.
Absolutely, yeah.
Were they Jewish businessmen who were, or women?
Some of them, yeah, some of them.
Oh, that's so interesting. In thinking about this kind of story, what do you think leads to the demise of, or what leads to the demise of quotas, Jewish quotas, as it were, in colleges?
Well, a big part of it, I think, was the end of World War II. Was that anti-Semitism really flourished in the United States and has this kind of ebbs and flows in different parts of the country at different times. It's like a sort of a pandemic. It's kind of low-key some places, it flares up. But after World War II, anti-Semitism was pretty seriously discredited. There was a really clear line from anti-Semitic practice in American colleges and universities, and anti-Semitism as expressed in Germany and the rest of Europe. But an interesting footnote to this, in 1969, after UW administrators had been kind of playing around with like enrollment management, that, those of you who've been to Madison know that the university only has a certain amount of space. It's kind of hemmed in by the lake. It's hemmed in by the residential neighborhoods around it and so forth. And so the, administrators of the university are trying to figure out, how do we fit all these people in who want to come here? The answer they struck on, and an answer they came up with, was, well, we should really try to diversify the university according to states. And certainly there'll be lots of space for in-state students, but we have an awful lot of students from Illinois and New York and Maryland and Massachusetts, and very few students from Wyoming and Montana and Idaho and Arizona. And so we should kind of have like go states where they kind of get like priority, and states where it's like harder to get in from there. The faculty revolted. They said, this is terrible. This is anti-Semitic. We know exactly what you're doing here, and we won't have it.
Same thing that Harvard was doing when they went. Something
that Harvard had done almost 50 years ago. And then the state of Wisconsin, because one of the things that distinguishes UW from other state universities around the country is that the state legislature has much more direct control over university policies than is the case in other states. The state legislature in 1969 said, boom, that's what we're doing, and instituted this kind of plan. So it had the effect of just like knocking the wind out of the sails of the campus Jewish community. The number of Jewish students on campus in the early 70s was far below what it had been in the 1960s. It was much more difficult for Jewish students to come here. By the 1970s, Jewish students who lived in Massachusetts and New York could go to a decent state university system. So that need wasn't there. And only gradually over the last, and really kind of accelerating, I think, since 2010, has the percentage of out-of-state students kind of returned to what it was in the 1960s. The legislature kind of instituted that, but they didn't exactly stick to it. And in the last round of major cuts to the universities, like in the early part of the 2010s, university officials kind of went to the legislature and said, listen, if you cut our funding by all this, we're going to have to admit like more out-of-state students and so forth to make up the difference, to help us, keep the power on and so forth. And like for the first time ever, the state legislature's response was like, yeah, okay, whatever. So that's kind of a big thing.
Some strange things.
But yeah, so UW in some ways was like in the 1920s was much more tolerant than some of its peer universities. And by the late 1960s, I mean, UW's decision made like national news. Oh. I mean, news magazines like covered that, and especially those that kind of focused on education issues, kind of looked at that and said, what is that, 1922? What's UW doing in 1971? And found that really odd and anachronistic.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us today on this museum moment. And thank you all for tuning in. Next week, we're going to be exploring, today is Juneteenth, and next week we are exploring African-American stories in Milwaukee, stories of allyship and partnership between the Jewish community and the African-American community. And so join us for that. If you've liked this or any museum moments, feel free to check out our Jewish Museum Milwaukee website, and you can always make a donation there. And thank you, John, so much for taking time out of your day and joining us.
Thanks, Alex. Always a pleasure.
Great weekend. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.